Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Deb Hammond. I am the Literature Chair, and I'm happy to welcome everybody to the club where it is our vision to be a dynamic cultural center for community learning. We have 30 programs in our enrichment series, and they're a part of our mission to strengthen our community through learning, giving, and sharing our landmark building. I'm really pleased to bring our next to the last literature program here today. We have Anne Morrissy, a graduate of Kenyon College and an author. She says her passion is for narrative history, and we see it in her book, Street Fight. I recommend it. She splits her time between Chicago and Williams Bay, Wisconsin, and since 2021, she's been editor of the Lake magazine in Lake Geneva. Anne Morrissy, thank you very much for coming.
So my book is called Street Fight, The Chicago Taxi Wars of the 1920s. It is about this wild period of history when you could have been riding in the back of your cab, and another cab would come up next to yours, and the driver of that cab would start shooting at your driver while you're on your way to dinner. So it was a wild time on the streets of Chicago, obviously for many reasons in the 1920s, but this is one piece of it that I felt people needed to know more about. So I wrote a book about everything that was going on with the cab industry and the cab companies at the time. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to read first the introduction to the book, which serves as a good introduction, hopefully, to the topic. And then I'll skip ahead and read a selection from a chapter later on in the book that gives you a little bit of an idea of what it was like in the city at the time. And then I'll take some questions after the reading. So, and as I said, the slideshow should go kind of hand in hand with the reading if I did it correctly. As far as the record is concerned, John D. Hertz and Morris Markin never once stood in the same room. Hertz, tall, bespectacled, and affable, would go on to become a household name for an almost incidental transportation innovation he pioneered, the rental car. Markin, heavy-browed, balding, and enigmatic, preferred to keep a lower profile. In the 1920s, both men stood at the dawn of an industry that still plays an important role in modern city life to this day: taxis. Each man ran a successful business in the taxi industry, businesses which, for much of the 1920s, happened to be in direct competition with each other. In those days, like today, there was a lot of money to be made by besting the competition. These business rivals would leave a deep and lasting impression on the taxi industry for decades to come, not just in Chicago, but throughout the United States. Yet as far as we know today, Hertz and Markin never shared a podium at a business conference. They never sat together for an interview with an assistant state's attorney in preparation for a grand jury hearing. And even when the companies they founded decided to sue one another, they preferred to send their attorneys to do their negotiating for them. When Hertz suspected Markin of attempting to tank the stock value of Hertz's company on the New York Stock Exchange, he does not appear to have demanded an audience with his rival. When cabs were destroyed, and drivers murdered, and taxi garages bombed, and even when some of the top leaders of the taxi industry ended up dead in a series of events that ranged from unusual accidents to outright murder, neither man appears to have sought an appointment with the other in an attempt to get to the bottom of the violence. Despite this practiced distance, Markin and Hertz remained the leaders of two of the biggest and most influential companies in the Chicago taxi industry during the Roaring '20s, that era of bootleg bathtub gin and scantily clad flappers, of jazz cabarets and audacious political corruption, of well-dressed gangsters with their Tommy guns, of a building boom that sent architecture soaring to scrape the sky. Chicago in the 1920s had it all, or was in the process of building it. And whenever possible, the city wanted to hold world records. By the end of the 1920s, Chicago boasted the largest fountain, Buckingham Fountain, constructed in 1927, the world's largest hotel, the Stevens Hotel, also completed in 1927, and was in the process of building the world's largest single building, Merchandise Mart, opened in 1930. Chicago did nothing by degrees. Like a racehorse, it ran full out in every aspect of urban living. As the hog butcher for the world, its stockyards drew as many as 500,000 visitors every year. Its politicians were known around the country for their big personalities and their brazen corruption. Even its murderers and organized criminals became international celebrities. Chicago in the 1920s stood at the peak of its power and economic influence, according to one modern historian. A New York critic, writing of Chicago in 1930, described it as the extrovert of cities and marveled at its confidence. Quote, "Never embarrassed, never apologizes, never blushes." There was so much to see and do, and suddenly there was a new way to get there. Around the country, but especially in Chicago during this time, taxis were an exciting new phenomenon, and a taxi ride around the city was suddenly an everyday luxury available to the average person. People took taxis to work, to the theater and to dinner, to go dancing in ballrooms, to brave the thrill rides at amusement parks, to visit friends, to meet trains, to go shopping, to watch ball games, to check out library books, to visit museums, to listen to jazz music, or sometimes just to see the sparkling city from the window of a moving automobile. Gone were the days of the staid and slow horse-drawn hansom cabs. Automobiles were thrilling and modern, and although the average person couldn't quite afford to buy a car, the taxi industry allowed everyone in the city to experience a taste of the good life. All they had to do was throw out their hand at a street corner or telephone a request to the main garage, and they could have their own personal on-demand automobile at any time. Hertz, the co-founder and president of Chicago's Yellow Cab Company, and Markin, the founder and president of the Checker Cab Manufacturing Company, had an outsized influence on this taxi landscape in Chicago. They were visionaries in a burgeoning industry. They were business rivals in an era of nearly unlimited growth and unprecedented wealth. They were extremely ambitious men. They had other things in common, too. They were both Jewish immigrants to America, born 13 years apart, Markin in Russia and Hertz in a village in Slovakia, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They both started on unrelated career paths before falling into the automobile industry, almost by accident. They both went on to enormous success. And through their respective companies, they both provided unparalleled employment opportunities for Jews, Black people, women, and other marginalized groups, thanks to their progressive ideas about employment and their egalitarian views about who had the right to pursue the American dream. But at the same time that these two men held the majority of the Chicago taxi industry in their palms, there was a dark side to the business as well. As taxis became more and more popular, beginning in the late 1910s, taxi drivers started skirmishing over things like union membership, cab fares, and turf protocols. By the dawn of Prohibition in 1920, these smaller battles had erupted into organized acts of business-related terrorism and deadly violence that often took place in full view of the public and killed innocent bystanders on more than one occasion. The vast amounts of money being made by the cab companies in the 1920s attracted gangsters who sensed an opportunity to line their pockets through graft, embezzlement, and extortion. And so these gangsters muscled their way into the industry as well. The many incidents that erupted along the way became known in the newspapers as the Taxi Wars, and they spanned a period of more than a decade, from 1916 to around 1929. All told, the Taxi Wars involved everything from sophomoric pranks to cold-blooded murder, from domestic terrorism and mass shootings to extortion, voter intimidation, bribery, jury tampering, and securities fraud. The body count was truly stunning. And yet, even at the time, the story was eclipsed by other crime happening in the city during the Prohibition era. Over the years, the taxi wars were nearly forgotten, so that when the industry began to shift again in the early 21st century, with the introduction of ride-hailing companies, no one even remembered how some of the long-standing taxi regulations had come to exist in the first place. At its core, the story of the taxi wars is a story of two men, Hertz and Markin, and the companies they founded vying for dominance in the market. At Yellow Cab, Hertz adopted a public-facing approach, often communicating directly with the taxi-hailing masses. At Checker, the always secretive Markin preferred to operate through trusted proxies and associates and rarely made public statements. But his influence was always there, steering the actions, steering the response. These two rivals knew that only one of them could win the ultimate taxi war, the battle for corporate dominance in this lucrative new industry. By the early 1930s, one of these men would obtain control of more than 85% of the taxis on the streets of Chicago and be well on his way to dominance in New York, Cleveland, Minneapolis, and Pittsburgh as well. The other would be out of the business entirely. This is their story. It is also the story of the thousands of drivers, mechanics, factory employees, washers, instructors, agents, supervisors, starters, dispatchers, operators, inspectors, stenographers, and bookkeepers, all of whom gave untold hours of tireless work to expand the cab industry in Chicago in these early days. Some of them were forced to give their lives as well. But before that, in the beginning, there was just a foggy day in downtown Chicago and a few dozen yellow cars emerging from the mist, ready to pick up their very first fares. So that gives you a little bit of an introduction to the taxi wars and how it became such a contentious business in the early days of the taxis. So just to sort of fill in a little bit of the gap between what I just read and what I'm about to read, the early days of the taxi industry were, Yellow Cab was sort of the first scaled up version of a taxi industry almost anywhere in the world. John Hertz had this idea in 1915 that they were going to start a cab company, they were going to scale it up very quickly, and they were going to promise that they could have a cab anywhere within the city limits and also out to Oak Park and to Evanston within 10 minutes, which meant that you had to have a huge fleet in order to make a promise like that in a city of the city of Chicago. So he very quickly started a business, then he started a cab manufacturing company to produce cabs to provide his cab company with the volume that he was going to need. And they hired and they hired and they hired, and they very quickly within the first year went from having 50 cabs on the streets to having like 1,000 cabs on the streets. And it kept going and it kept going. So the other companies look around, and they were all much smaller companies at the time, and they say, well, if he can do that and get this, get this money that he's getting from this, maybe we can do something similar. So I'm going to get the year wrong now, but I want to say around 1922, two men actually here in Oak Park decided to found the Checker Taxi Company. And they went with a slightly different business model, which is that instead of making it a top-down company, they were going to make it an cab driver-owned company. So the Checker Taxi Company comes on the scene, and they offer basically a deal where you bring your own car, you have it painted like a Checker taxi, and you become the owner of your own sort of business within this affiliation-based model, which is Checker Taxi. And that becomes a very popular option as well. And so Checker Taxi then scales that model up extremely quickly. And by about 1923, they're already sort of skirmishing on the streets of Chicago over all of these different turf protocols and rules and all of these different things, which is what you'll learn about all of that in the book. So where we're at now, I'm sorry, I'm getting the years wrong. Now we're in 1921 is where I'm going to fast forward to a little bit, because in 1921 is when those turf protocols and everything start to really ratchet up, and the companies start fighting with each other. So the next section I'm going to read is Chapter 6, Stay in Your Lane is the title of the chapter, the first grand jury investigation and the murder of Thomas A. Skirvin Jr., 1921. Chicagoans opening their newspapers on Sunday morning, March 6, 1921, probably did not guess that on page 8A of the Chicago Tribune, they would find a very direct and politely scathing missive from John Hertz in a 2-column yellow cab ad titled, "So the Public May Know." The attacks made on our cabs late at night by members of a so-called taxi cab company are not due to labor troubles, as has been stated, but to ordinary thuggery and a desire to intimidate our men who are getting the great bulk of the public trade, he wrote. Without ever naming his rival publicly, Hertz made it clear that he considered checker taxi drivers the sole instigators in recent street battles, and that Yellow Cab had a long list of supporters on its side, including city law enforcement and the state judiciary branch. Hertz rejected the concept of a taxi war, arguing that, quote, Yellow Cab is doing no fighting, and that Yellow Cab drivers were in fact, quote, almost powerless to defend ourselves against our enemies. Hertz went on to describe the implied checker drivers as, quote, gangsters and products of the pool rooms, coded language for thieves and con men, who drove for a fraudulent company that did not adhere to the city ordinances. He cited a recent court case in which a coroner's jury had declared Checker's affiliation-based model a subterfuge to avoid liability and financial responsibility. He accused checker drivers of jealousy, claiming that Yellow Cab's recent decrease in rates had, quote, angered them to the point of bombing our stations and attacking our cabs. In concluding this unusual ad, Hertz declared, "We can't indulge in revolver battles in the streets." In fact, a revolver battle in the street is exactly what inspired the ad. Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood in the 1920s was a pleasant, upper-middle-class part of town that attracted those who preferred to live in comfortable homes and modern, full-service apartment buildings close to the amenities of the 450-acre Lincoln Park itself. The sidewalks around the park were full of fashionable families who spent their leisure time strolling through the Lincoln Park Zoo and the Lincoln Park Conservatory, or dining at the popular Cafe Brower, an upscale restaurant overlooking the park's South Pond. A post-war building boom was underway in the neighborhood, and smaller wood frame homes were rapidly being replaced with soaring palatial apartment buildings and residential hotels that offered the finest linens, silver, and crystal, as well as optional maid service. However, that March, it became clear that even this quiet, genteel neighborhood located miles north of the Loop was not immune to the perils of the taxi wars. The day before Hertz's strongly worded ad ran in the Tribune, in the early morning hours of Saturday, March 5th, a group of 15 Yellow Cabs and checker taxis sped alongside each other on the otherwise quiet streets that passed through the park, driving erratically as bullets flew in both directions, their sharp sound punctuating the darkness. No one was hit, but following the incident, 2 drivers from each of the cab companies walked into a nearby police station, hurling complaints about the other company's drivers, everyone asserting that they were merely defending themselves against the other's aggression. 3 months later, on Wednesday, June 8th, the violence started up again. What began as the usual skirmish over cab stand dominance quickly radiated across the city, each incident of violence spurring an escalated retaliation somewhere else. Disputes at the Hotel Sherman cab stand led to fistfights and smashed car windows, resulting in arrests. Police arrested a checker driver for, quote, malicious mischief and inciting a riot when his vehicle struck a yellow cab, though the driver contended that he had just been rear-ended by another yellow cab first, forcing him into the car in front of him. According to later allegations by Hertz, several yellow cab drivers had been slugged during a brawl by checker drivers. As a result of the melee at the Hotel Sherman that night, the checker taxi company put all of its drivers on high alert and told them to be aware of any other incidents and to come to the aid of their fellow drivers. Checker driver Jack Fox heard these warnings, but Fox was a man who was not easily intimidated. He had been working in the Loop that evening and knew firsthand about the trouble at the Hotel Sherman. He soon joined it. As he later told the story, he was returning to a downtown cab stand after dropping off a fare when a rival yellow cab started speeding toward him from the rear, shooting into his car. Fox hit the gas and pulled a .32 caliber revolver out from under the seat of his cab, where he kept it for personal security. The 2 cabs began racing side by side, heading west on 12th Street, a running gun battle underway as they shot at each other's cars. As they approached Racine Avenue, a policeman on the corner saw the 2 cars racing toward him and witnessed Fox firing behind him into the yellow cab. Because of this, the policeman determined that Fox was the aggressor in this street battle and signaled the yellow cab to stop and pick him up. He climbed onto the cab's running board as they took off in pursuit of Fox, who had turned north. The policeman began shooting at Fox with one hand as he held onto the speeding car with the other. Not realizing the bullets were now coming from a policeman and not the yellow cab driver, Fox continued to return fire behind him. Fox was heading for the safety of a checker taxi garage where his best friend, Abe Schwartz, worked as the night manager. Making a hard turn into the garage and slamming on the brakes, Fox fled the vehicle and ran into the building. Pulling up just seconds behind him, the police officer jumped off the running board of the yellow cab and ran toward the garage in pursuit. At the door, Schwartz blocked the policeman's path, informing the officer that he was on private property and did not have permission to search the premises. As Schwartz stalled the policeman, Fox ran out the back door and escaped. The policeman arrested Schwartz for obstruction of justice and took him to the Maxwell Street station for questioning. When Fox eventually learned that Schwartz had been arrested and was being questioned, he decided to lay low for a few days and quietly left town for South Bend, Indiana. Fox's brother Philip, however, stayed in the city, and his night was just getting started. The two brothers shared the Dodge touring car they drove for Checker, each taking a 12-hour shift. They had been close since childhood when their family emigrated from the Galician region of what is today Poland and Ukraine and settled in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood in Chicago. It was a tough place, an area surrounded by enclaves of other immigrant groups who were loudly anti-Semitic. As children, the Fox brothers frequently got into fights with boys from the Italian and Polish settlements nearby and grew up into hardened combatants, earning the nickname the Rough Boys. The night that his brother got into the running gunfight, Philip Fox was only 21 years old. Just the previous month, he had received divorce papers from his wife after a youthful, misguided marriage that had lasted just 3 months. Much later, Philip Fox's son would remember him as aggressive, industrious, and very fastidious in his habits and appearance, and would describe him as a man, quote, with a chip on his shoulder. Fox's brother was already in trouble that night because of the taxi wars. But by the next sunrise, Philip Fox would find himself at the center of a murder investigation. The incidents between Yellow Cab and Checker Taxi that night continued to multiply. In an area of the city then known as the Rialto District, another checker driver was sitting in his taxi when a yellow cab drove by and shot 4 bullets into his car. He was unhurt. Checker driver Harry Rosenthal experienced a similar assault on the city's near south side when a large unmarked touring car sped past him and opened fire, missing Rosenthal, but leaving his cab riddled with bullets. Not long afterward, a similar touring car fired on police standing a few blocks away. The police returned fire, but no one was injured in the exchange. In the city's Black Belt, a checker driver was surrounded by 4 yellow cabs who forced his car into the curb, smashing his wheels and windows. Yet another checker driver said 5 yellow cab drivers attacked him, smashing all the windows in his cab. Around 1 a.m., the violence finally resulted in tragedy. Yellow cab driver Thomas A. Skirvin, Jr. stood in front of a yellow cab garage on the city's west side. By this point in the night, nearly every taxi driver in the city must have heard about the fights, the broken windows, the raw aggression, and the shootings, even if they had not experienced any trouble themselves. Skirvin was chatting with a few colleagues, all of them keeping an eye out for attacks, when, without any warning, an unmarked touring car sped east past the garage, throwing out a deafening hail of bullets. There were at least 3 gunmen in the car, and they unloaded around 25 bullets into the building, one of which struck Skirvin on the left side of his chest, above his heart. He was rushed to St. Anthony's Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. Skirvin left behind a wife, a 3-year-old son named Arthur, and 17-month-old twins, Julia and William. Learning of the cold-blooded murder of one of his drivers, Hertz was enraged. An hour later, around 2 a.m., he issued a statement to the press announcing that he would offer a $5,000 reward for the arrest and conviction of Skirvin's murderers. "We have gone just as far with the murderous methods of the Checker Taxi Company as we intend to," he declared. "From now on, it is going to be a fight to the finish." So that is just a little sampling of all of the murder and mayhem that you will learn about during the taxi wars. Spoiler alert, that is not the end of the story by any means, and it gets much more complicated, and there's a lot of sort of intersections of things that were happening in the city that then find their way into the taxi wars. So moving forward, Checker Taxi experiences a sort of takeover or an attempted takeover, and a civil war breaks out within the Checker Taxi Company, and it is related to the mobsters of the era who are trying to sort of muscle their way in and take over the leadership of the Checker Taxi. There are some very interesting things that are happening business-wise as well. I mean, as I said, the Yellow Cab Company was one of the first large scaled-up cab companies in the country, and they were actually working very hard to create an industry that the public perceived as safe and clean, and they were working very hard to make it an industry that did not have a bad reputation at the same time as all of these things were going on the streets of Chicago. So there's a lot of push and pull there, I guess I would say, in terms of it was a dangerous time in the city of Chicago, and also it was a very innovative time, and they were trying very hard to make something that was that would last and that would be a long-term benefit to the city of Chicago. So there's all sorts of interesting facts you can learn from learning about the taxi wars in Chicago in the 1920s. I'll start, before we go to questions, I'll start by answering one question that I get at almost every reading I've ever been to, which is, how did you first hear about this, or how did you get interested in this topic? And I actually have a personal family connection to the cab industry in Chicago. My mother's grandfather, my great-grandfather, was the president of the Yellow Cab Company in the 1920s. He actually started out as a cab driver. He worked his way up to be essentially the right-hand man of John Hertz. They had been friends from a very young age, and John Hertz hired him to work with him, and he trusted him implicitly, and they worked very closely together, and they worked together very well. And so by about 1925, when John Hertz was a visionary businessman, and he was not only doing Yellow Cab at the time, he was not only manufacturing cabs at the time, he was also doing these side projects, one of which turned out to today be known as Hertz Rent-A-Car. Another side project he had going is he worked with the city to basically start the city's bus system, and he manufactured all the buses initially for the city and the bus system. So he got very busy by about 1925, and he decided he wanted to step away from the day-to-day operation of Yellow Cab, and he put my great-grandfather in as president of Yellow Cab. My great-grandfather was president of Yellow Cab for about 2 years, and then he died under kind of mysterious circumstances at the height of the taxi wars. So it was always rumored in my family that his death was not in fact an accident, but that it had been related to these business wars that were going on. I always had that kind of in the back of my head, and I would ask people who were Chicago historians if they knew anything about the taxi wars, and almost nobody I talked to had ever even heard of them before. So during COVID, when we all had so much free time, I decided I'm going to start researching and see what this was about and see if this family rumor is even plausible. And I started researching some things related to taxi wars, and I found more incidents than I ever imagined, and I found more threads to pull at than I could possibly have guessed. And so I thought, I really think that there's a book here. I tried to find any information I could about it. There were no books about it yet. There were very few even articles or any modern historical, no historian had really touched this yet. So I thought, I think there's a book here, and I started putting together a book proposal, and that turned into a book deal, and then I spent a year and a half writing and researching, and so the product of all of that is Street Fight here. And it was a very research-heavy project, and it is full of fascinating information that I don't think you're going to find anywhere else from my own research. So that is how it all happened. And to answer your question, I still can't tell you what happened to my great-grandfather. I can tell you that he fell off a horse in Jackson Park. Everybody he was with that day claimed that they didn't see the accident happen. They don't know exactly what happened, but we came around a bend and he was on the ground and he had a skull fracture, and nobody would ever talk really about what happened that day. And so what I came away from research in the book is that we'll probably never know what happened to him, but it is certainly not beyond the realm of possibility that there may have been some foul play involved. Let's put it that way. I couldn't rule it out, certainly. So anyhow, I'm happy to open it up to questions if anybody has some. Yeah?
How did the taxi wars end?
How did the taxi wars end is the question. So I don't want to give away too much of the ending of the book, but I will say that the Depression hitting in 1929 had a huge impact on the taxi industry in Chicago and around the world. And partly, a series of events happens to both the owners of both of the companies, to both Morris Markin and to John Hertz. A series of very dramatic things happen to them in the book, so I don't want to give that away. But as a result of that, as a result of one of them becoming sort of gun shy, I would say, about even staying in the taxi industry. And then also as a result of the Depression and that changing sort of the economics of it, one of them decides to sell out to the other one. Let's put it that way. But I don't want to give away too much because that's kind of the denouement of the book is sort of what we're working toward here. But it was essentially they got tired of the danger of the industry, and the economics changed such that it didn't really make sense to have these two huge behemoth companies competing against each other during the Depression. It made more sense for it to consolidate into one company.
I seem to remember Checker Cab, so I'm wondering if they kept the name Checker Cab Company even though they were bought by Yellow Cab?
So I'm not going to give away who bought who, but you may or may not be right about that. Let me put it that way. And they did keep both the companies' names and separate identities, even though it was owned by the same person. Partly, I think, because repainting all the cabs would have been a major undertaking, and some people were sort of brand loyal because of various things that were going on. And so, if you were a brand loyal yellow cab rider, you could still have hailed a yellow cab all the way up through the modern era. You can still hail a yellow cab technically. So they did keep them as distinctive brands, but they had a single owner then at that point. Yeah.
Is Yellow Cab still owned by Hertz, like as in Hertz Rental?
No, so John Hertz, as sort of a side note about Hertz Rent-A-Car, he started a company in the 1920s that he himself called the You Drive It system, which is what we would call the Hertz Rent-A-Car system. He eventually, within a few years of piloting that program, proving its success, scaling it up a little bit, he then sells his stake in the You Drive It system to General Motors as part of a deal that he makes with General Motors for some of his side businesses. He then joins the board of directors of General Motors, but he doesn't technically own the You Drive It system at that point. He didn't own it for about 30 years, and then later in his life, in the 1950s, he decided that he didn't really like, I think General Motors had divested the rental car business from their portfolio, and he didn't like how it was being run, and so he came back in and he spent a huge amount of money to buy back Hertz Rent-A-Car and have it under his own name again, under his own ownership again. So he did eventually buy back Hertz Rent-A-Car. He was definitely more involved later in life he was on the board of directors of several big companies. He was involved in Lehman Brothers Bank. So he became very, he had a wide portfolio and he was very involved in many different things later in life, but he did retain Hertz Rent-A-Car. So that is his name and that is his, I don't know exactly what happened when he died in the 70s. I don't think his family took it over, so then I can't tell you exactly who is in charge of it now, but it is still, his foundation is still involved with it. It's still very much a part of their history. His ownership is still a part of their history.
By coincidence, I'm in the River Forest Library Book Club, and this month we've read a book by John Binder, who's a sociologist who's sort of an expert on the Chicago mob, called Al Capone's Beer Wars. So there's actually only one paragraph in the book on the taxi wars, so apparently you've got a lot of research that isn't common, but I just happen to know because I finished the book a couple days ago. There apparently are about 20 homicides attributable to the taxi wars. I mean, part of what Binder does is he catalogs all the people who were killed in the gangland wars, and he attributes about 20 of them to the taxi wars.
I think that would be a low number, would be my guess, but like 20 verifiable murders, yes, to the taxi wars, and that sounds about right. There were many mysterious deaths that happened around the taxi wars, like my great-grandfather and some other executives of the companies suddenly, dying in mysterious car accidents that don't make any sense, and things like that. So, I mean, I don't know that we'll ever know the exact number, but there was a lot of intersection between the beer wars and the taxi wars, what we would call today sort of the bootleggers and the prohibition wars were very much intertwined with the taxi wars because there were a lot of the players were happening to overlap between the two industries. So when we get into the checker taxi civil war, checker taxi gets taken over, essentially, briefly, by a man named Bob McLaughlin. Bob McLaughlin is essentially a mobster. His brother Red is definitely a mobster who's aligned with the North Side gangs in Chicago. And Red McLaughlin, when his brother is president of Checker Taxi, Red McLaughlin is convicted of several murders in the taxi industry that are related to people who are trying to stand up to Bob McLaughlin or oust Bob McLaughlin from his role as president at Checker Taxi. So during that period, there are a lot of identified mob hits, essentially, that happen at Checker Taxi. There's a wild story during the changeover when Bob McLaughlin. So it's a little complicated because he gets in as president and then he gets ousted briefly, temporarily, and then he comes back in with an even stronger iron fist. And during that period where he gets ousted and they're changing over between he's getting ousted and new people are coming in, the day that the new people are set up in the offices on the west side of Chicago at Checker Taxi, a group of gunmen come during broad daylight and open fire on the Checker Taxi garage and end up killing 2 people, injuring a couple more, and it's essentially a statement by the McLaughlins to say, we'll be back, and this is war, essentially, right? So there was a lot of just very dramatic incidents happening, but some of the stories were getting overshadowed by even more dramatic stories happening as part of the beer wars. So I think that's partly how we kind of lost some of the collective knowledge of the taxi wars, is just that there was so much going on in Chicago in the 1920s that it was hard to keep up.
I have a question about logistics.
Okay.
About the fact that the cab company promised someone would be at your door in 10 minutes. What happened then? Was it a negotiated fare? They didn't have little clicker boxes, did they?
They did. So her question is, what were the logistics of hailing a cab, and what was the pricing on a cab ride of the 1920s and that sort of thing? How did you pay? So one of the things that was a revolution in the taxi industry that John Hertz piloted, essentially, is that every yellow cab had a taxi meter in the cab, and the taxi meter was how you knew that you were getting a fair price, essentially, and what you could charge for your ride. Even from the very earliest days of the yellow cab company, what you could charge for your ride was set by the city, which meant you could not charge more than X amount per mile, right? And in the beginning, it was maybe 15 cents a mile or 20 cents a mile. I can't remember exactly what the numbers are. They're all in the book if you're interested. But it was a regulated rate that was kept track of by a machine in the car that was a taxi meter that was sort of a new technology of the time. And you would get the cab by either you could hail it directly on the street, or you could call the yellow cab dispatch center. And at this time, the yellow cab main building, which is still standing, by the way, it's down on 21st Street, 21st in Michigan, and the building is still there, and one entire floor of that building was the telephone operator's dispatch center, and it was the largest telephone operation center in the world in 1921. And you would make a call, it would go to the main dispatch center. There were maybe 40 dispatchers. I think there was a picture of them up on the slideshow at one point. And they would then figure out where you wanted your cab. They would then make a call to what was called the taxi stand starter station. So there were various places around the city where Yellow Cab had almost like a little hut with a phone in it. And a person stood there all day and answered the phone, and that person who answered the phone was talking to the dispatch center on 21st Street, and they would say that, yeah, you need to dispatch a cab to whatever address it might be. And he would send the next cab that came to the cab stand would be dispatched to the next call. So they had enough drivers and enough cabs in every area of the city that they could promise that they would send a cab to your door within 10 minutes, no matter where you were, which was pretty remarkable. Yeah.
Tell us about what happened, what Hertz did when the stock was being manipulated after they had gone public.
Yeah, so initially Yellow Cab was a private company. I can't remember exactly the date. I think maybe 1924, 1925. They decided to go public on the New York Stock Exchange. And John Hertz was a little uncomfortable with that idea, but they were persuaded to do it because they were scaling up so quickly and they needed funds and they were trying to manufacture all their own cabs, and there were a lot of moving parts to this. So they went public on the New York Stock Exchange. They were on the New York Stock Exchange for about a year, and he realizes that at a certain point that the stock is acting it's not keeping up with what it should. So the company every quarter is reporting, increases in ridership, there are increases in orders to their cabs, which you would think, as they're a more and more successful company, the stock price would go up and up and up. What they see is that the stock price is actually going down while the reports of the company say that the company is doing great. So he calls up a friend of his, a banker from Boston, who he knows through the business world, named Joe Kennedy. Joe Kennedy, father of John F. Kennedy. And he says to Joe Kennedy, hey, I don't know what's going on with the stock for my company, but I don't think, it's like something's going on and I don't think it's, on the up and up. Can you look into it? So Joe Kennedy looks into it and he realizes that most of the buying and selling that is leading to the decrease in stock prices is coming from one brokerage in New York, which incidentally is a brokerage that Morris Markin was very connected with, right? So Joe Kennedy says, okay, instead of accusing them of doing this and going at it, sort of coming at it head on, we're just going to manipulate the market back again until we spook them into leaving our stock alone, right? So Joe Kennedy sets up a suite for himself at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and he has like 4 phone lines installed and a ticker tape machine. And he spends all day, every day, buying and selling stock in Yellow Cab. He gets John Hertz to give him all of his stock to play with, and John Hertz recruits some of his friends in Chicago who have stock in the company, and Joe Kennedy has complete control over their stock for a while. And he calls up in the morning and he decides, okay, we're going to sell all the Yellow Cab stock this morning, and then at the end of the day, we're going to buy it all back. And he creates this volatility in the Yellow Cab stock that is so unpredictable that the brokerage that was trying to manipulate the stock gets spooked and eventually just gives up and doesn't touch it again. And so Joe Kennedy actually did end up with a stake in the Hertz rent-a-car business as a thanks for his work saving the Yellow Cab stock. And Yellow Cab did eventually go back to being a private company because John Hertz didn't like any of this, essentially. He didn't want anything to do with that, so yeah. But that's sort of a wild side story, but one of many wild side stories in the book, actually.
How does your book include how things like the taxi war, what the city government did to either benefit from it or record it because they wanted the public safety to, they thought public safety would be a better way to get income from the city?
Yes, so the city regulations are a big part of the book because it was one of the many things that the companies are fighting over is Checker Taxi feels that Yellow Cab is sort of in the pocket of the city government. John Hertz was, because he was a visionary business leader and was very involved with the city officials, he actually was kind of friends with Big Bill Thompson, and he could bend the ear of the city government at the time. So John Hertz had a little more influence at shaping the regulations around the taxi industry, and Checker Taxi really didn't like that for obvious reasons. I will say, to John Hertz's credit, he really seems like he was trying to establish this industry as one that could be trusted, right? Like consumer confidence was a huge concern of his, and so he did go to the city and say, I want you to regulate this. I want you to regulate this more because I want people to feel that when they get in a cab, that is a respectable, reliable thing that they are doing. So the city starts out with almost no regulations, and over the period of the taxi wars, they keep adding more and more regulations to the industry, some of which are maybe a little bit biased toward yellow cab, which then makes Checker Taxi very unhappy, and that kind of starts some of the challenges. Big Bill Thompson is the mayor at the beginning, and then Mayor Deaver comes in. Mayor Deaver is not as much aligned with either of the two cab companies, and he's kind of got his hands full with the beer wars. So a little bit less happens during his reign, but then Big Bill Thompson comes back in again, right? And so the cab industry is very, it becomes a very intertwined thing with the city, partly because of John Hertz's influence with the city. But to his credit, one of the things that John Hertz did, one of his legacies in Chicago to this day, is that he identified that the traffic problem was costing his cabs a huge amount of money every day, just sitting in traffic that wasn't moving. And this was before they had stoplights. So he went to the city and he said, I think that putting in a stoplight system would actually improve the traffic situation significantly. I feel so strongly that we need it that I will basically pay for a pilot program to try installing stoplights along Michigan Avenue. I will pay for everything up front. We will try it for 2 years, and if you think that it is a benefit to the city, you will pay me back and you will start implementing more stoplights across the city. So it's because of him, essentially, that they put in the first stoplights. Almost immediately, people are like, this is so much better. Having traffic cops blowing the whistle and trying to direct with their hands was not working by 1923 or whatever year this was. So it really was an immediate success. The city immediately said, oh my gosh, yes, we need more of these, and they very quickly start putting stoplights all over the city. But that was because Yellow Cab went to the city and said, we need this. I have identified from many studies that this is going to make everybody's lives better. I will pay for it, and then we'll get it going. So, Yellow Cab was very involved with the city from its earliest days in ways that benefited them, but also in ways that benefited the city, right? So it was, in a lot of the cases, it was sort of a win-win.
Are you aware of any overlap between the taxi wars and the St. Valentine's Day Massacre?
I am, in fact. It's actually in the book a little bit. One of the people who was killed at the St. Valentine's Day Massacre is a man named Al Weinshank. Al Weinshank had been a garage manager at Yellow Cab for many years before he eventually quit working at Yellow Cab, and he got hired to essentially be one of the captains for Bugs Moran's gang. And so he was present at the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and he was murdered at the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. There's also there are the Gusenberg brothers, I believe, are two of the people murdered at St. Valentine's Day Massacre. They are suspected of being being aligned with Red McLaughlin and some of the taxi garages that were getting bombed later in the taxi wars, some of the murders that were happening. It is suspected that the Gusenbergs were involved in those at the taxi wars as well, but they were obviously more involved with the beer wars. So. You'll learn a little bit more about some of the characters from the taxi wars that then go on to leave the taxi industry and transfer over to even more dramatic industries, let's put it that way.
Could you tell us about how visionary Mr. Hertz was in the benefits that he provided his employees? Because thinking about way back at the turn of the century.
Yeah, he was a very magnanimous employer. I will say, if you read about him, you will read about how he is very anti-union. I initially thought that was maybe not very progressive of him. However, he was anti-union partly because the unions at this time were susceptible to being taken over by the mob. The mob would come in and they would strong arm everybody in the union to vote for a mob leader to be the head of the union. And then, of course, you can't, oust the head of the union if he's a mobster, right? So John Hertz associated unions during this era with the mob, and he was very against mob rule, essentially. So he decided that he was going to get ahead of this by saying that nobody at Yellow Cab was basically nobody could join a union. You would be fired immediately. But he also he said, I don't want any employee to even feel like they need to join. I want to treat them so well that I don't want them to feel like they would ever need to band together to advocate for themselves, because I'm going to be treating them so well that it won't matter. So he actually pioneered the use of employee stock options. It was one of the first companies in Chicago that offered everybody who worked at the company for over so many, I think about a year, you got an ownership stake in the company, which then made you ineligible to join a union because you were an owner of stock of the company, right? He was pretty smart. But he also provided, as a Yellow Cab, even a cab driver, anybody, a stenographer, the women who were washing the cars, anybody who worked for Yellow Cab had access to free dental care, free medical care provided by the company, a free tailor. There was a Yellow Cab band you could join and be in the band. They had a Yellow Cab camp up near Cary, Illinois, and you could take your family for free and reserve a week stay at the Yellow Cab camp in the summer. They had a Yellow Cab luncheonette that you could go and have a very reduced fee meal, take your family and eat during the day. Cab drivers all got free coffee. He was being very, very generous to them from a perspective of, I want to run the best company I can possibly run, and I can't do that unless my employees are the best employees they can be, and therefore I'm going to treat them extremely well. And so it was a very progressive approach to employee relations for the era.
Okay, thank you very much, Anne.